It's been a span of 18 years since a team not from the top 5 leagues has triumphed in the Champions League. Since then, football has become so monopolized that each year only around 4 teams truly have a shot. Even when Porto clinched it in 2004, the stars had to perfectly align in every conceivable way for the wonder to occur. Imagine this, after a historic run of 5 league titles in succession. In 2002 Porto were on the verge of losing the title for the 3rd year in a row, which in a club that naturally demanded success led to chaos. The average crowd fell to 10,000 and the coach was dismissed, but rather than opting for a high-profile coach, Porto appointed the man who had been at the helm of União de Leiria. When it comes to the Portuguese league, teams don't come much smaller than that, so why him? Well, that man was Jose Mourinho, and to anyone who had encountered him, even back then, he was no ordinary individual. His life had been a whirlwind since he was a child, but his focus was always a known single thing: football. His father was a football manager and former player, and when Jose was 9, on Christmas Day, he was let go. It spoiled the holidays and it transformed Jose. From that point forward, he would assist his dad in any way possible. By the time he was 12 he was the one compiling his dad's scouting reports. Don't buy into the myth that Mourinho never played football. For 2 years he was on the field for Belenenses and Rio Avenue, while his father was the manager, even scoring a hat-trick in the Portuguese Cup. It was only after all of that they both agreed Mourinho was better suited on the sidelines, so he started studying sports science and later football methodologies, working as a PE teacher and attending any football courses he could. At the age of 24, he participated in his final amateur football game, transitioned to a position as a youth coach at Vitória de Setúbal, advanced all the way to assistant coach, and then his life took a turn forever. He was recruited by Sporting CP to be Bobby Robson's interpreter. After just a few conversations, Robson was astounded. He could see Mourinho was one of the most brilliant football intellects he had ever encountered. Swiftly he promoted him to assistant coach, and over the next 7 years he became utterly indispensable. Robson, who brought him along with him to Porto and Barcelona, then lending his expertise out to Van Gaal, as Robson transitioned to a sporting director role. Throughout these years, Mourinho learned from them and bided his time for his moment in the limelight. The storm was gathering. In 2000, he got the opportunity to take over Benfica entirely by himself. It was a dream job, but it went terribly wrong. By the time he joined, the transfer window had closed, the club was in disarray, and before he even took his seat on the bench for his first game, the team was already trailing. After just 11 games, elections had been held and the new president chose to replace him with a different manager, even though Mourinho had just defeated rivals Sporting 3-0 in the Lisbon derby. Now feeling somewhat adrift, Mourinho waited for the commencement of the next season and took over at União de Leiria. Despite the step down, this decision set him up for success. Managing a team with virtually no funds, Mourinho became acutely aware of all the hidden talents scattered among the league's smallest teams, and midway through the season, he had propelled Leiria all the way to 4th place in the league, 1 point above FC Porto. Which brings us back to the start of the video. Once at Porto, Mourinho did not hold back. With his iconic stoic stance, he told everyone they had their worst team in over 2 generations, but made sure to reassure things by telling the fans, "I am confident, next year, we'll be champions." From that point forward, Mourinho started reshaping the club. Even if his tactics weren't the most groundbreaking, his influence was remarkable elsewhere. Training was promptly altered, now adopting a more scientific methodology, every exercise designed down to the finest detail. The team's morale soared. It seemed he was capable of inspiring them beyond what anyone else could envision, and on the field you could see it. The team was a symphony that never missed a beat. Despite their elegance on the field, every player had a bit of something extra. In Portugal we call it raca, that tenacity, that readiness to risk everything for a tackle, to exhaust themselves on the field if that means launching one last counter-attack. They would do it all for Mourinho. He was more than a coach, he was their guiding light. But above all, what truly solidified all of this was his strategy in the transfer market. Mourinho retained only a handful of the team's players that he deemed to have some potential: Costinha, Bea, Deco and Ricardo Carvalho, and initiated a revolution, offloading the rest and instead of signing the best, most expensive players he could, utilizing the knowledge he had gained at Leiria about the league's hidden talents and signing those overlooked players who heck knew were undervalued. And eager to repay Mourinho for the opportunity they had been given, he said it himself when asked about Derlei specifically: "I promised him at Leiria, wherever I go, you'll come along." He gave it all for himself, the fans, his family. But above all he gave it all for me. With Porto struggling to find the funds they needed, Mourinho chose to sell defensive stalwart Jorge Andrade to Deportivo for €13 million, as well as Carlos Paredes, a former prodigy who was the youngest captain in the history of Olimpia, for 4.8 M, as well as loaning Hugo Ibarra back to Boca for 400k. Then with this money, Mourinho brought Nuno Espirito Santos from Deportivo de La Coruña for €3 million, poached Jankauskas, who had been in great form during his loan at Benfica, paid Real Sociedad 2.4 M for him, and then scoured all Portuguese minor teams, acquiring both Marco Ferreira and Paulo Ferreira from Setúbal for 3.1 M, Cesar Peixoto from Belenenses for 1 M, as well as Derlei, Thiago and Nuno Valente from Leiria for 1.2 M. Along with this, Mourinho also executed some clever free transfers, securing Maniche from Benfica, as he had been marginalized by the club and compelled to train by himself after refusing to sign with agent Jose Veiga, bringing back Porto captain Jorge Costa from Charlton after he had been ousted from the club by the previous manager, and acquiring Boavista captain Pedro Emanuel on a free, despite the fact he had just recently led Boavista to a staggering league title. All things considered, Porto emerged from this with 6.8 M in profit and a team that at the time seemed like a group of unknowns and washed-up players with no experience or chemistry, however, with Mourinho protecting them from criticism and guiding them with his unbeaten charisma, ambition and confidence, they went on to not only secure the league title as he had promised, but they did it while annihilating the opposition, achieving the highest points total in history and surprising everyone by securing the UEFA Cup, humiliating millionaire Lazio and Larson's Celtic. The standout players that year were perhaps $500,000 signing Derlei, who netted an astonishing 12 goals in the competition, being the top scorer, and Deco, who was the top assist provider. Despite having played in the Portuguese second tier just a few years prior, however, every player in the team had a role, even those on the bench. It seemed almost like a perfect utopia, and it would only get better. In his second full season at the club, Mourinho went a step beyond all that he had accomplished so far, with everyone convinced they had already surpassed all that was even deemed as possible. Mourinho was convinced they could go even further, so with all the players looking to capitalize on the team's momentum and move to a bigger club, Mourinho gathered all of them and requested them to trust in him and remain, that they could clinch the Champions League, and so they agreed, as Mourinho would be quoted stating, "Sometimes the best investment is to retain your own players, regardless, in order to generate some revenue." Mourinho permitted Postiga to depart to Tottenham for 9 M and Capucho to Rangers for 1. He adhered to his strategy and acquired Maciel from Leiria for 1.5 M. Pedro Mendes for an unspecified sum and Bozingua from Boavista for merely 1 M, while taking a risk on Carlos Alberto, signing what appeared to be the next Ronaldinho for 2.5 M, but above all, he re-signed Benny McCarthy from Celta de Vigo, despite his refusal to remain at Porto 2 years prior. At the conclusion of his loan, with the squad now fully formed, Mourinho had now accomplished what to this day he refers to as his masterpiece. From the first 11 he fielded on his debut at Porto, only Bayer remained. In front of him, Jorge Costa and Ricardo Carvalho were as solid as a rock, exceptional at ball recovery and capable of providing support in transition. Alongside them, Nuno Valente and Paulo Ferreira were prototypes of the modern fullback, providing the width demanded by his diamond formation and covering the entirety of the flank. Costinha in the middle, an anchor, a titan, a squid with 8 arms and 8 legs, with many names. At nearly 30 years of age, he had reached the peak of his game. In front of him, Pedro Mendes connected him to the two creative geniuses that were Deco and Maniche, who then supplied Derlei, who quite simply was 10 years ahead of his time, and Benny McCarthy, the perfect poacher, while at any moment the likes of Carlos Alberto and always injured Alenichev could come in at any time and disrupt a match. Overall, they were incredibly utilitarian, ruthless in transition, incredibly composed and capable of converting any sort of scenario into a goal. They were Mourinho's Real Madrid. A decade earlier, having the chance to play and win the UEFA Cup was the ideal opportunity. If a year before the players lacked experience, they were now as self-assured as Mourinho, and so they just continued as if nothing had changed. Sure, they knew they weren't the top team in the tournament anymore, but as Mourinho stated, talent isn't the only way to secure victories. The journey commenced with a draw against a partisan team coached by Lothar Matthäus and a 3-1 loss to Los Galacticos. Porto were tied for the bottom spot in the group after 2 matches, yet they didn't seem disturbed. Once again, Mourinho's unflappable persona seemed to hold the team together, and with that motivation by their side, following that loss to Real they went 34 matches without a loss in all competitions. The subsequent game was against Drogba's Marseille, and despite the big man's early goal, Maniche and Derlei combined for 2 goals, before Lenichev made it 3 and sealed the match. Then, in the rematch versus Marseille, it would also be Lenichev who would secure the result with a single goal before McCarthy pulls off a brace versus Partizan, allowing Porto to sneak up to second place, before facing Real once more, the real and final test. Against all odds, following that 3-1 home loss, Porto arrived at Santiago Bernabéu filled with confidence, and even despite conceding just 8 minutes into the match, Derlei ended up securing the draw. However, it was right there that Porto faced their biggest setback of the season. Derlei had torn his ACL. The team's doctors couldn't even be certain that he would be back before the end of the season. This made Mourinho sound the alarm and led him to expedite Carlos Alberto's arrival half a year early. He knew it would be challenging to get him ready for Europe that quickly, but in his own words, he was utterly audacious, and the magic that came with that could assist the team. With the group stage concluded, Porto advanced in second place, 3 points below Real, which meant they were destined to face stiffer competition in the knockouts, and so it was. Manchester United would be their initial opponents in one of the inaugural matches in the then brand new Estadio do Dragão. Everyone anticipated Sir Alex to impart Mourinho a lesson or two, but even though Porto fell behind early, McCarthy scored a brace with 2 incredibly tenacious strikes and secured them the victory against all odds. Still, Mourinho knew victory wasn't assured yet, and just as he had forecasted in the press conference at Old Trafford, Porto once again fell behind early on, meaning if the game was to conclude like that, they would be eliminated on away goals. On the 75th minute, clinging on to whatever hope remained, Mourinho subbed in Ricardo Fernandes, a free kick specialist. And I am not kidding. On the 90th minute, Porto gets the perfect free kick. Ricardo prepares to take it, and Benny McCarthy pushes him aside and insists he should take it himself. Mourinho goes wild on the sideline, and then, bam, it sails over the wall. Tim Howard gets a hand on it and Castagna knocks it in on the rebound. Porto were through to the quarters. Mourinho had taken down Sir Alex in Fergie time. With the underdogs all going in full force, Porto then met Lyon, and don't for a moment think that was weak opposition. They had Juninho, Edmilson, Maluda, Eschen, Elbier, Diarra. They had won their Ligue 1 7 consecutive seasons and had humiliated Bayern Munich in the group stage. Regardless, Porto maintained dominance the whole time, securing the first leg 2-0 and drawing the second at 2 goals each, with Maniche emerging as the hero. It was in the semi-final against Deportivo that things became serious again. They were super Depayer. They were no less formidable than Real and Barcelona. In fact, they had been competing with both of them for the pinnacle of Spanish football, and just 4 years earlier they had been Spanish champions. Even the mighty AC Milan fell 4-0 before them, just weeks before the match. It was right here that Mourinho finally seemed to be a bit more apprehensive. The first match dragged all the way down to a 0-0 final result. Jorge Andrade had been sent off for Depayer, but regardless, Porto now had to defeat them in the away game. It looked like serious trouble. But then a light shined down on Mourinho. After 4 months, Derlei had fully recovered from his injury and would be back for the away leg, and alongside this, Mourinho noticed something intriguing. Depayer were known for being very physical, however they had 7 players who were 1 yellow away from not playing in the final, so the mind games began. Throughout the whole match, the Porto players told them that 1 bad foul and they would never get to play a Champions League final. Deportivo were on their tippy toes, afraid to make a single wrong move. This anxiety got to them, and after 150 minutes of football, Mourinho could feel them breaking, and out of nowhere they did. Penalty for Porto, and it couldn't get more poetic. Derlei was the one to score it. Mourinho subbed him off and all of the Porto fans gave him a standing ovation. He looked up and was completely reduced to tears. He had taken them to the final once again. With all the other competitions wrapped up, the squad boarded the plane and flew to Gelsenkirchen. Their Monaco awaited them. Once again, don't let the team's current state deceive you. They had Deschamps as coach, Evra, Morientes, Juli, Cisse and Dado Perso. They had defeated Depayer 8-3 in the group stage and had already taken down Real and Chelsea on their way to the final. Still that day, it was clear Porto had something they didn't have. All night Porto gave them hope, only to then crush them in each counter-attack. First, 19-year-old Carlos Alberto made history, opening the scoresheet and becoming the youngest ever Champions League final goal scorer, and half an hour later, Deco and Alenichev both scored to settle the result down at an impressive 3-0, as Mourinho held the trophy. His demeanor seemed relaxed, even. Finally he was allowed to switch off his ever-confident persona and enjoy his success. When asked about it he said, "I don't like to call this my masterpiece, it was our masterpiece," and in fact by the time the tournament was over, besides Deco sharing his spot as the tournament's top assist provider, no other Porto player was topping any charts. Their top scorer was Benny McCarthy, and 18 players had scored more than him. It had more than obviously all been a result of a collective effort, but that collective had been designed and handcrafted by Mourinho himself. Out of the players he had picked for that squad over the years, only a few failed to achieve success. I guess this is that part of the movie where they tell you how every character's life turned out. So, Nuno Espirito Santo became a Porto legend and a high-profile manager. Paulo Ferreira, Ricardo Carvalho and Bozingua all moved to Chelsea, for 20, 30 and 21 million respectively, and all of them went on to win the Champions League again. Carvalho was the third most expensive defender of all time and went on to become arguably the greatest Portuguese centre-back of all time. Deco went on to secure second place in the Ballon d'Or and was transferred to Barcelona for 21 million plus Quaresma. Despite being 30 years old, Nuno Valente still realised his dream move to the Premier League. Bea retired at Porto. He is also considered by many as the greatest Portuguese goalkeeper of all time. He is now on the path to become the next Porto president. Pedro Emanuel assumed the role of captain once Bea departed and also retired at Porto. Speaking of captains, Jorge Costa retired 2 years later in Belgium, and despite relinquishing his armband to Bea in order to avoid conflict after his return, he is widely considered the greatest captain in the history of the club. Maniche completely revitalized his career, moved to Moscow for €16 million and went on to play for Chelsea, Atletico and Inter. Castilla also experienced a career resurgence, despite being 30, and joined Maniche at Dinamo and Atletico. On the other hand, both Derlei, Alenichev and Benny struggled significantly with injuries and saw their careers stagnate after the tournament. Carlos Alberto moved back to Brazil for €10 million and never reached his potential. He regrets having left the club. In total, Porto made over 130M with the sales of these players. No team in Europe made more money over those years. They did it without ever spending more than €10 million in a single transfer market. It was the last fairy tale in the history of football so far.